Well, hello YouTube, it's me, Fortmaster, and welcome to a new reaction. Well, I picked this one purely because the title intrigued me when I saw it in my suggestion feed. Why is Berdly in Deltarune an over-analysis? So, if you watched my channel for any meaningful length of time, you'll know that I have a bit of a sordid history with Berdly-related content. And, well, just the question, why is Berdly in Deltarune? You can literally say that about any of the characters in a game. I mean, like, why is Susie in Deltarune? Why is Noelle in Deltarune? Why is Chris in Deltarune? So to ask a question like that, well, I mean, for lack of a better word, I'm very curious about what this video will actually be about. Like, is it going to be going over the merits of, like, him as a character? And, like, why he's even in the game to begin with? Is, like, going to go over, like, is it going to be the opposite of that? And, like, why he shouldn't be in the game? Honestly, I don't know. But, you know, I'm intrigued. And, at the end of the day, that's all I need to be to watch a video. So, yeah, I guess with all that out of the way, original video is linked in the description if you haven't seen it for some reason. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day. And, yeah, with all that out of the way, let's get this thing started then, shall we?
April 17th, 2021.
Chapter 2's development is going well. I had a friend try out a beta version. She enjoyed it a lot. After, when I asked her favorite character from Chapter 1 or 2, she said Berdly ... I don't know what to do with this feedback.
Hello, Toby Fox. Big fan, but can you please kill off Berdly? It would mean a lot to me. Thank you.
Oh, and you have the chance to kill off Berdly. Okay, right.
September 19th, 2021. I take it back, I take it back! Due to the structure of Deltarune, and especially Undertale having almost all your friends try to kill you at some point, you could say flawed characters are the name of the game here. But the character's likability is also by far one of the most praised aspects of these games. Part of this is that, well, people appreciate their arcs and generally understand that good characters should be flawed, but with these characters being as goofy and exaggerated as they are, even their negative traits often still come across as endearing. Because when it comes to fictional people, no amount of attempted murder matters, as long as you aren't annoying about it. So you'd be hard-pressed to find a Toby Fox character who's generally disliked. However...
Yeah, that's the one thing. I think it was... I think it was on a video, I think it was on one of my reactions to an overly sarcastic production video. I can't remember which. And you'll have, like, so many people kind of, like, defend or like a blatantly evil character, but they'll hate a good character that's just annoying. Which, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, if you have people that simp over a literal mass murderer who, like, tried to take over the world, and they'd wish death on somebody just because they have a weird voice or they act a little strange. I mean, that's kind of sad, isn't it?
However, with Deltarune Chapter 2 came a notable exception to this rule. Yet another character who's antagonistic for the first portion of their screen time, but one not so easily forgiven by the fanbase. Probably the only Toby Fox character to receive such intense initial backlash. That's not true, the early Undertale fandom fucking hated Alphys. And one whom it's still very common and acceptable to casually rag on. You know him, you love him, have opinions on him. Berdly. Oh, sorry. Berdly. As I'll get into, people's opinions on this guy can get pretty complicated, but a major deciding factor for your reaction to him is just going to be whether you find him more funny or annoying. The former will at the very least make him entertaining, even if your appreciation doesn't go beyond that, while the latter is, again, literally the worst thing a fictional character can do.
I'm very much on the side of just finding him funny. There are not many people that I hate in, you know, Deltarune or Undertale characters, I should say, not people. None of these people are real.
So the initial reaction to Berdly upon Chapter 2's release was rather vicious, and his #gamer personality, combined with people finding him dislikable, earned him a characterization as a bigoted incel. These days, the fandom at large agrees that this is going too far, and I think some people exaggerate how much this attitude still exists in order to defend Berdly from the perceived haters. I put out a survey asking how people felt about his character, including how their opinions had changed and why, and About 67% of the over 700 respondents had overall positive feelings, with 23% being neutral and only 10% being negative. Now, these results are definitely affected by participation bias because if you're watching niche Deltarune channels in 2024, you're most likely more on the insane end of the fan spectrum, as opposed to the filthy casuals who played Chapter 2 when it came out and moved on with their lives. I imagine if I polled a truly random sample of anyone who's played Deltarune, Berdly would be a lot less favored since he's more of an acquired taste, it seems. But my point isn't why do people hate Berdly so much, he's just a little guy. While that is a sentiment I can get behind, what I'm most interested in is the fact that even among the people who like Berdly, which actually seems to be the majority of dedicated fans, there's an attitude that he largely exists as comedic relief and thus is not that deep. However, when asked to rate the objective quality of Berdly's writing, respondents answered even more positively than they did regarding their personal opinion on him, with 16% being neutral and less than 2% being negative. This is probably because not every character needs to be astoundingly deep to be good. Some characters serve different roles than others, and people think Berdly serves his role as comic relief well.
You just have to look at Newbert. You see him like 5 times throughout the entirety of Chapter 2, and yet he's the pinnacle of character writing.
This is an issue, though, because if Berdly isn't that deep, then I can't write a 20-minute script.
You little overachiever, you.
Then all the time he spent living in my head rent-free has been worthless. Luckily, over the past 2.5 years of rotating him in my brain, much like chicken in a microwave, I've come up with a lot of ideas about aspects of his character that I think go unacknowledged. Perhaps some hot takes, if you will. Through exploring those, I think I can prove my idea of what his purpose in the game really is, particularly what might happen with his character going forward and why he's the major victim of the Snowgrave route. Starting off simple, did you know Berdly has 2 jobs? Berdly has 2 jobs. Why does he have 2 jobs? We see him working at the library in Chapter 1, but in Chapter 2 he says he's late for a shift with Miss Boom and proceeds to exit the library, not being seen for the rest of the chapter. I'd say his second job is most likely at the church, since we can't go inside yet, and Miss Boom would be related to Alvin. And I know this sounds like an irrelevant detail, but putting Berdly in the library again so we can talk to him after a chapter he was prominently featured in is an opportunity that was sacrificed to include it, so I think it can tell us a few things about his character. Because he isn't making money, he calls attention to being a volunteer assistant. He may very well just enjoy his jobs. He likes the smell of freshly picked up books and taunting Chris about their family debt. But also, Berdly cares a lot about what people think of him, and volunteering seems like it would supplement his smart kid identity, so he may be doing this to increase his reputation points, as he might put it, or, well, to feel like he's of use. I can't help but think of how Noelle, a character who Berdly wishes to be as smart as, and someone who is more intrinsic to his motivations than people realize, has a reputation for being helpful. This isn't just out of kindness, of course, she also has unhealthy people-pleasing habits. See how in Chapter 1 she even assumes needing help is the only reason Chris is talking to her. Berdly seeks to be helpful because he wants to seem noble, seen most explicitly in how he appoints himself as Noelle's savior throughout Chapter 2, while Noelle's inherent helpfulness and pushover tendencies are taken advantage of by other people, including Berdly. Both of their attitudes hurt them, though, because Berdly has a rather negative view towards receiving help. So here's my first hot take. Berdly isn't academically stupid so much as he thinks he is just because he isn't the smartest person ever. He says he's only number 1 in the class because Noelle studies with him. Okay, if you were number 2, would that make you not smart? More importantly, what's wrong with having a study buddy?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Well, this is coming from somebody who thought they were kind of like near the top and then kind of got shown where they truly were. But I remember one of the Discord servers I'm currently in, and I have a lot of friends in there now, but when I first joined in, it's a server for, people like me who like trains, like steam trains, like railroading in general. But it wasn't until I went into that server that I realized that I knew a lot less about steam trains and stuff like that in general than I thought I did. I guess it's the whole thing of big fish in a small pond sort of deal, because until I joined that server, I never really had any friends who shared my love of trains. So there's that, the kind of like the shock mentality of, you're not as good as you thought you were. But with Berdly, it kind of comes from the complete opposite direction, where seemingly because, you know, he won the spelling bee through what he might feel as dishonest means, you know, winning the spelling bee purely because Noelle got, you know, choked up on a word that reminded her of her missing and possibly deceased sister. There's like the whole thing where you can like very reasonably suggest that, you know, he where he thinks that he doesn't deserve, you know, the moniker of smart kid, because the first instance of that like reputation being applied to him was done like via pure random chance almost, and taking advantage of somebody else. So, and I mean the whole, you know, I mean, nobody wants to be found out as a fraud, no matter what you potentially are a fraud in. Or if he has this inbuilt fear of like, oh my god, I'm not as smart as everybody thinks I am, better hang out with the smartest kid in class so I can kind of like try to leech off them to get my grades up. And I'll start doing all this sort of stuff around the community so that, you know, people's opinions of me aren't just purely based off me being smart. So I mean, it's entirely seeable.
It's not cheating, it doesn't mean he isn't working hard. Berdly refuses to use Susie's idea for solving the puzzle because that would mean accepting help from someone quote-unquote inferior, and he holds himself to too high of a standard to do that. He'll only accept help from Noelle because she already knows he's a so-called fraud. That's probably another reason why he's so against grouping up with Chris. He doesn't want them to find out about this. But Berdly did make it to the final 2 in the spelling bee on his own. He could still do decently without Noelle, but he's become reliant on her because without her he can't be the best, and he needs to be the best, to the point where he's ashamed to be helped at all. Susie's way of putting things might be, you are stupid, but it's okay to be, and that makes sense for her character. She kind of underestimates her own intelligence. But it could be rephrased as something like, you are imperfect, but by acknowledging that, you can admit your shortcomings and accept help. I think this theme is supported by Berdly's later actions. The aftermath of not assisting him by cutting his wires has him forced to unplug himself on his own, thus getting injured, an act of self-sacrifice that's treated as a bad thing. But him deciding to collaborate with the others gives us the Suzelle scene, so it kind of succeeded.
Oh god, just remembering that scene where Noelle's choking Berdly out like she's Homer from The Simpsons. Oh god. I remember the first time I saw that. That was so funny.
Most blatantly, he literally saves the day by gathering all of the Fun Gang's allies to help them beat Queen, since he's in no condition to help on his own. His quick thinking in doing this, as well as his Noelle rescue plan, again support the idea that he isn't flat out stupid in every area just because he struggles in some. What he needs is to be open to working with others, even if they have worse grades or whatever. An area of struggle for him that gets especially emphasized is in understanding others' feelings, and this is where I bring up the neurodivergence aspect that you might have expected if you took the survey. Just over half of respondents, a large portion of which saying they were neurodivergent themselves, said they thought Berdly was neurodivergent, with less than 10% definitively saying he wasn't. To heavily simplify why people think this, while I use the broader term neurodivergent in the survey, Berdly's intense fixation on video games to the point where someone else sharing this interest can make or break his opinion on them, combined with his bluntness and inability to grasp social cues, can be easily read as autistic. Obligatory disclaimer, no, I'm not saying these traits automatically make someone autistic or neurodivergent or that this was necessarily intentional, it's just a common interpretation often held by people who are autistic themselves, please be nice. Anyways, with this
God, yeah. Well, I know for me specifically, I mean, I have Asperger's. And granted, for me, I've always been on, like, a very edge case. You know, my mom specifically said if I was born, like, 30 years earlier, I would have just been the weird kid. But for me, especially when I was younger, my biggest problem was just not being able to pick up sarcasm. Like, you know, of course, I've gotten better as I've gotten older. I hope, at the very least. But for me, it would always be either, you know, whoever I'm talking to would have to specify that was sarcasm. It's like, oh, okay. Or it would take me, like, a good 5 seconds in my head, like, almost to the point where you could hear gears grinding. It's like, that was sarcasm, wasn't it? And I swear, the old meat computer, nobody's as perfect, isn't it?
angle in mind, there's an interesting comparison to make between Berdly and Noelle's neurodivergence. Noelle is also easily readable as autistic, but as someone who's better at masking her traits than Berdly is. A key part of her character is being unable to express herself and make herself heard. Like, she's fascinated by scary things, but other people don't really know this. Quote, Chris is the only one who knows how weird I am. Her nerdiness is largely confined to her blog. Berdly, however, is loud and proud about it and makes his interest part of his identity. Actually, he doesn't mention gaming in the light world at all, which is why it's absent from beloved pre-Chapter 2 fic Umris. So you could argue he himself unmasks in this more fantastical and video gamey dark world.
Yeah, I can also see that, but also, oh god, I can't remember from what this was, but the specific thing that, like, boys and girls with autism, they show differently. That's part of the reason, from what I've heard, that, a lot less girls get diagnosed with it, because their signs are different and not as prominent as they are in guys.
Either way, while Noelle masking her feelings has consequences, she does avoid being treated as a nuisance by others in the story and the fandom, where Berdly obviously doesn't. And of course this has to do with Berdly being a dick, but it does also feel like while Noelle knows how to make herself as inoffensive as possible, even to her own detriment, Berdly is just not as capable of doing this, because even when he isn't being a dick, he doesn't suppress his more harmless quirks, even if they're still potentially irritating and cringe. Take Queen's line,
"Okay, there's nothing wrong with him, he's just annoying."
I mean, using a text-to-speech device purely for Queen, that works pretty well. I'm gonna have to. I like that. It's perfect.
Even though she admits he hasn't done anything genuinely wrong to her, his behavior being off is enough for her to shun him behind his back. I think the fact that so many Deltarune fans, including myself, are neurodivergent contributes to these annoying traits being found more endearing and even relatable instead. People who answered yes to thinking Berdly was neurodivergent were about half as likely to dislike him as those who answered no. This is a tricky subject though, because at least when it comes to his socially inept moments, these are usually portrayed by the game as stemming from self-centeredness, more of a personality flaw he can improve on than a symptom he needs to accept. It's much easier to make a case
definitely
for intentional positive autistic coding with a character like Alphys, who, among other traits, literally infodumps to you about anime, which, while used for humor, is still meant to be endearing, and her passions are celebrated by the game. At the end of the day, though, the interpretation definitely holds up a good bit. What is this line about, exactly? Intentional or otherwise, I think it's a large reason why people often relate to Berdly, for better or for worse. Probably the biggest reason for people relating to him, though, is that he quite literally has gifted kid syndrome. Kind of? So, a major trigger for Berdly becoming the way he is was apparently everyone going from ignoring him to praising and having high expectations for him. However, the game offers surprisingly little evidence for others presently viewing Berdly this way outside of his own word. Alphys and his classmates, excluding Susie and Noelle, never mention him. The two adult characters who do, Rudy and Toriel, don't support the idea that Hometown at large thinks highly of or expects anything from him. This is something I'd noticed before, but this one comment did get me to consider the idea that Berdly was straight up wrong about these expectations being placed on him by others, and it was just him doing this to himself. Ultimately, I do think we're meant to take his word for it, though, because the game usually points out when Berdly is incorrect about something, as he often is, but it's just never implied that he's wrong about this. So who are these mystery people Berdly feels this pressure from?
Well, I mean, it might not be the town at large, but I could very much see it being a case that, his family, the people that, especially when you're a kid and teenager, you spend a good, 60% of your time with.
Well, the lack of dialogue to hold up his claims about what his reputation is like may very well be a coincidental oversight, but I wouldn't be surprised if his family was a big factor here. That is a pretty common source of academic pressure, after all, and this line about Berdly being forgettable strikes me as odd because we're never really told why he would be. Was he shy or something? We're given surprisingly little details on this. I think this frankly weird self-perception for a
forgettable
little kid to have makes the most sense if he was to some extent neglected or undervalued by his parents specifically. If you aren't familiar with this idea, I'm not entirely pulling it out of my ass, There's a lot of support for it if we consider his relationship with Queen to parallel that with his real mother. The idea that Queen is reflective of all of the kids' maternal relationships sort of contradicts the common assumptions we have about Susie's home life, so I'm not completely sold on it, but I mean, Queen is a blatant stand-in for Noelle's mother, right? Like, she wants to be Noelle's mom. And Queen chasing after Noelle is directly compared to Berdly chasing after Queen. He wants her to be his mom. Also, this flavor text clearly compares them to a son and disinterested mother, like that's obviously the joke here. In general,
yeah, right.
Berdly's a character who's particularly defined by his relationships. On my survey, I provided 8 reasons people could select for why they liked Berdly, and my decision to have half of them be dedicated to his relationship seems to have worked out, as most of these options were selected by a significant portion of people.
Oh, okay, nice.
Similarly, people also cited his poor treatment of other characters as common reasons for disliking him. We all get defensive of our Blorbos, I guess. And I think this goes to show that none of his relationships are really one note or without contradictions. Case in point, he doesn't seem to entirely hate Chris, or even hate them at all. We know they've played games together, and not necessarily just to compete, as Chris has played Minecraft with him after helping him reinstall the game. He's frequently salty about them siding with Susie instead of him, most apparent in one of his most distressed points in the game where he's struggling to solve the puzzle and Chris is the only person he wants help from. He simultaneously belittles them so he can feel superior while also craving their approval. It almost feels like he's trying to be smug anime rivals with them, like are they even number 3 in the class or did he just make that up for dramatic effect? I'm not convinced. My favorite
Oh god. Berdly and Chris anime rivals, but it's only a one-sided rivalry and the other one doesn't know they even exist. Oh god, I want to see that in an anime.
Favorite relationship of his is definitely with Noelle, though. I think the game does something pretty unique with them. So, Berdly isn't an incel, pervert, misogynist, nice guy, whatever.
Yeah,
I don't really think
remember all
Toby
those.
Fox would write a character with those beliefs and then give them a happy ending without those beliefs ever being condemned or even properly addressed. However, on paper, his character does have the outline of that archetype. He is a male character who asserts himself as the protector of this feminine girl who he speaks over and assumes the feelings of, including thinking she has a crush on him when she's actually a lesbian. He takes full credit for accomplishments he couldn't have made without her help and acts jealous of and blames her childhood friend when she teams up with them. Also, he has bouts of gamer rage. I don't think this combination of traits is a coincidence. What the people who deemed him a bigot in the early days of Chapter 2 missed, though, is how he subverts this trope. Berdly was actually only pretending to be romantically interested in Noelle because he valued her as a friend, as much as he didn't need to do that. I, for one, find this extremely...
God, yeah, that's the funny part. I mean, like, I was pretending to be in love with you. And she's like, you were what? I mean, evidently, he wasn't doing a very good job of that.
refreshing. He essentially straight-baited us. Additionally, the girl he actually comes to admire is the loud, rebellious butch one. As much as his assertion that Noelle's the second smartest student is self-centered and disrespectful and false, he does mean it as praise. While Chris's act in his second battle is to play dumb, Noelle's is to play smart. What he likes about her is not her pushover tendencies, but her intelligence and her gamerness, much like with Queen. These aren't traditionally feminine traits. A lot of the bullshit that spills out of Berdly's mouth is stuff he kind of believes in, but his talk of her being a helpless doe or whatever is pretty much just him straight up lying to brag to Chris. He's completely self-aware of his reliance on her. Mind you, while his true motives don't show any actual toxic views, that doesn't mean his actions can't come across that way, at least at a glance. When asking people to select reasons why they disliked Berdly, I actually split he treats Susie poorly before his crush on her and he treats Susie poorly/grossly after his crush on her into 2 options, and people were more likely to select the latter than the former, even though that's technically when he's nicer to her. Personally, I don't find any of his advances towards her that much more extreme than anything Noelle or Alfie's does, but I see why some people would find him basically working alone time with Susie into his rescue plan a bit, well, schemy. And that's actually part of why I don't think Berdly ever had genuine romantic feelings for Susie. There's a pattern of him having a weird understanding of what a crush even is. Obviously, there's his misconception about Noelle, but additionally, if you check on him twice after the Queen fight, he treats it as Chris flirting. And while misreading someone's
Well, I mean, given the player's history with Fresk, I mean, that It's not out of the realm of possibilities.
Kindness, as them having a crush on you, is easy to see as an egotistical and comedic trait. Low self-esteem can also contribute to this.
Just the background footage. Is it just me, or does it really annoy anybody else when you see them playing and they're just completely ignoring the actual task and just letting Noelle fall into the void? Like, thinking back, I don't think I let Noelle fall into the void once.
Paying attention to the phrasing, Berdly didn't just think Noelle had feelings for him, he thought that was the sole reason she helped him, and so he pretended to reciprocate. Because why would somebody be nice and helpful to you if they didn't want something in return, right? And while Susie begins being much
really
kinder
sad
to him than we give her credit for, and I understand why he would be touched by that, being head over heels after a single conversation is pretty quick turnaround. He has very personal beef with her throughout the chapter that's distinct from the comparatively playful rivalry he has/thinks he has with Chris. This is a very dramatic change. And you could argue he still has a crush, it's just a shallow one, but why does he get uncomfortable and backtrack after failing to ask her to kiss him? Why was he speaking too quietly for her to hear in the first place? He's not a shy person. It's almost like, since she showed him an unexpected kindness and he struggles to differentiate platonic from romantic advances, he misinterpreted his own feelings as a crush when he didn't actually want to kiss her to begin with.
Jeez, it's almost like Berdly is a multi-layered and multifaceted individual with that's actually a very complicated character the more you think about it. Granted, I mean, this might be just me, and like when I see characters, stuff like that, I very much, like, unless I get like super into them or obsessed, like my thought process about them is very surface level. But like hearing all of this and how it could actually work out with Berdly, like it's truly fascinating, the amount of just subtext and stuff like that works itself into it, like into his character. Like, I've never thought of, like, most of this before with him. It's nuts.
This reading technically could be unintended, but to be honest, even if it is, I still think it's better and makes more sense. In fact, I think his crush being forced would be a more common interpretation if people weren't inclined to just take everything about him at face value, I guess. I've also seen people act as though his interest in Susie is, like, confirmed to be an important future point of conflict, forgetting that he immediately denounces his feelings for her after deciding the Dark World was a dream. I think this is where the assumption of Berdly being solely and always the butt of the joke begins to diminish the story a little bit. For example, people really like Queen's line,
I did not ask him, I did not ask him, I did not ask him.
And I agree, it's funny, but I also feel people run too far with the idea that Berdly forced himself onto Queen's team, and they ignore when this is completely recontextualized. When Queen betrays him, Berdly lets slip that she said she wouldn't roboticize Noelle's face if he... presumably if he joined her. Queen says she lied about that and also about being a gamer, another iconic line. And yet people miss how this tells us that Berdly didn't initially join Queen entirely of his own will. Because why would she say she was a gamer if she didn't want him to join her? Yeah, she didn't ask him because she lied to him and threatened Noelle. Sometimes something can be funny and also communicate other things. Deltarune is a very silly game that does this a lot, so it's a bit frustrating to see Berdly get the joke character treatment. Much like him, Queen and Spamton's dialogue have comedic value more often than not, partially just due to the way they speak, but that doesn't stop them from being treated seriously by the narrative. I think the tone of Berdly's writing is most comparable to that of Lancer, very silly antagonist whose emotions are still important and who still gets to be a significant part of the narrative.
Only, you know, Berdly doesn't make a satisfying squash sound when you use him in your inventory.
Berdly certainly has more comedy in his veins than the average Major Deltarune character, and is something of a butt monkey as he's generally just a pathetic guy, but in boiling him down to just that, we miss rather obvious subtext. I'd argue Berdly's backstory doesn't come out of nowhere at all. It's not a sob story meant to justify him, but rather recontextualizes everything about him, and still his insecurities and such are heavily hinted at as early as his truce with Chris. Granted, his backstory is told to us rather unsubtly compared to how Toby Fox usually presents background information about characters.
But then again, this is information coming directly from Berdly, and from, everything we've seen so far, Berdly isn't the most subtle of characters to begin with. So again, you have to kind of look at it through that lens.
While we've had people like Undyne explicitly tell us about their past before, never have we had a character do this during a heel-face turn where they admit their issues and attribute them to this one specific event from their past, explaining exactly how it affected them, complete with visuals. Obviously, a large reason it was done this way was to include the detail that Noelle froze up at the word December, which is a major hint that something happened to Des. This arguably makes the whole thing a bit shallow, right? Like this scene was mostly put in to serve a greater purpose unrelated to the character it's actually about. As much as I feel I've proven that Berdly can be deep, at least if you want him to be, a lot of the things I've brought up might be more subjective interpretations than things that were actually intended by Toby Fox.
Yeah,
and I will say that there is still value in reading into things beyond what the writer intended. That's why I included those ideas anyway, death of the author and all that. But when talking about a character's purpose in a work, especially an unfinished one where you're trying to predict what's going to happen with that character next,
again, I feel that little pang in my chest every time somebody says unfinished. Like, I swear. I remember somebody jokingly saying that, it's going to be a decade before this game is actually finished. But at this point, like... Oh god, when did Chapter 1 and 2 come out? So, Deltarune Chapter 1 was released in 2018. Almost 6 years ago to the day that I'm recording this. And then Chapter 2 was released 3 years ago. So, I mean, if we can expect, Chapters 4 and 5 to either release... at this point, I highly doubt they're going to release this year. Probably next year, if they're going to be released anytime soon. But, that's going to be Chapters 3 and 4, and then Chapters 5 and 6 are probably going to be released either together. So that's another couple of years, depending on how fast. Like, it literally might be that this game, from the release of its first chapter, might take almost a decade to get out. And that is scary and kind of depressing to think about.
The author's intention does kind of matter. So let's talk about something that's definitely on purpose. You can kill Berdly. What's up with that? The weird root is meant to be evocative of a creepypasta. It's literally implied to be the Dark World manifestation of Noelle's interest in creepy glitches and secrets, or rather, the secret's interest in her. It's this bizarre hidden path that can only be found through a highly specific series of steps and is all about breaking the rules of the game, letting you kill enemies when you previously couldn't. So its existence is kind of wish fulfillment. Of course, there's the morbid curiosity aspect, but more importantly, we want our choices to matter. Where Undertale's No Mercy comments on the lengths the player will go to because they love the game and want to see everything it has to offer, the Weird Root seems to comment on the lengths we'll go to break free from the linear narrative that we've been given. We want Deltarune to give us the infinite choices Undertale did. We want it to let us kill people. We want to kill Berdly. Don't you want to kill Berdly? I mean, he really sucks. Wouldn't you prefer if he wasn't in the game? Well, okay, obviously most players don't feel good about killing Berdly even if they don't like him. He's a kid, nothing he's done comes close to deserving to die, not to mention all the deer abuse it's taken to get to this point.
Oh god, yeah, and just the amount of, oh god, poor Noelle, the amount of stuff you have to put her through in a weird route, ugh.
But the game doesn't just leave it at that. The whole lead up to his battle could have easily been a dark joke about Berdly being dumb and arrogant and not realizing something's obviously wrong. This would have worked fine, as the Weird Root isn't meant to feel like something that's supposed to be in the game, so it goes unacknowledged by most characters, and there's a lack of consequences compared to Undertale's No Mercy.
Lack of consequences yet. We have no idea how, the whole fact that, he doesn't wake up at the end of Chapter 2 will play into Chapter 3.
Instead, the game has him drop his act in a way we don't even see with his heel-face turn in the normal route. In the normal version of this fight, Berdly senses that Noelle is feeling coerced, but identifies Chris as the source instead of Queen, jovially declaring them a kidnapper. So I think it's very important that in the Weird Route he admits for once that he has no idea what's going on, just that Noelle is being hurt. And the thing is, he doesn't get any development in this route, we're simply seeing him in circumstances that drive out his best qualities. So yeah, you get to kill off the obnoxious asshole character, but you do have to see his most likable scene in the game first. And like I said, something that separates the weird route from No Mercy is the eerie lack of consequences. Not in the choices not mattering sense necessarily, but most characters aren't aware of what you've done, so you're never confronted about it. It's important that the two major fights in this route are Spamton, the one who helped you do those things in the first place, and Berdly, who is emphasized as not knowing what the hell's going on or the force he's actually up against.
That's another thing I never quite realized. Yeah, I mean, of course there's the lack of consequence, but like, unlike in, Undertale where, the genocide route is you are killing everyone to the point that they've basically made it a state of national emergency to get out of your way. In the weird route, yes, you're killing like all the available enemies on the street, but unlike in Undertale, the enemies are, visible on the street, so it's not so much you're killing everybody, you're just killing anybody that you come across. And that's a lot smaller and more localized than it would be otherwise.
He's a far cry from Undyne the Undying or Sans, who know what they're getting themselves into, which can make you feel even worse for him. As per the track title, Berdly is misfortunate, but he's often the butt of the joke for this, as it's usually somewhat his fault for being annoying or arrogant or dumb. And that doesn't really apply here in the slightest. You might normally wish Berdly wasn't in the story, but if you're going to make that happen, the game will make sure you question that decision as much as it possibly can.
Yeah.
Oh, and speaking of Spamton, he actually parallels Berdly in quite a few ways. It doesn't seem to be a coincidence that he's the other unique Snowgrave fight. Berdly was initially forgettable and gained a sudden spotlight with Noelle's accidental assistance. Then he spent all his time chasing that spotlight by relying on her, and now he's afraid of what will happen when they separate.
Where Spamton is already past the point of separation with the person that gave him his power. Huh. Okay. Again, another connection I never would have thought of.
Spamton's products didn't sell until he suddenly became a big shot with the help of...
It's just fucking Castor, okay? He's literally Castor.
And he relied on this person for his continued success until being abandoned by them. Berdly was picked up by Queen before she realized he was annoying and started avoiding and later betrayed him. Spamton was invited to live at her mansion in his big shot days and thrown out when they ended. Both have a final fight where you need to cut them free from something. Both have fights taking place on roller coasters. Fools! This is victory smoke. It means my car is getting second form. Berdly's Dark World sprite could be interpreted as him having multicolored glasses, and even if not, he shares a heterochromic appearance with Spamton. Even Spamton laying eggs makes sense now.
Yeah, okay, you know what? Not gonna say anything.
Ow. What's the point of all this? Well, Berdly fears losing the person who helped him get this far, while Spamton already has, so it stands to reason that Spamton is what Berdly could become. But he's not there yet. He can get better, realize what he's chasing isn't important, show more gratitude towards Noelle before they have to go their separate ways, instead of acting like he takes her for granted and ending up unable to support himself without her. Or, at the very least, he can stand up for her and die trying thanks to Spamton's assistance. Okay, is he like dead though?
Yeah,
Berdly
that's the question.
needs to be frozen through a different means than other NPCs because he's a lightener. More specifically, Noelle can only freeze Cyberworld enemies because they're computer programs, which can be frozen.
Oh my god, Toby, how long did it take you to think of that?
Get it? Nothing suggests being frozen is identical to dying, though. A frozen computer software will eventually work again, and freezing enemies is possible even in the normal route. Now, since frozen enemies are shown to remain ice statues after being defeated in the weird route, does this mean they're stuck like that forever, so it's functionally the same as death? Maybe, but that's not actually important to my point. I just care that being frozen isn't technically the same thing. Now, unlike Ice Shock, Snowgrave is described as fatal, and has the word grave in it. So even if the Darkners you freeze aren't, it sounds like Berdly's probably dead. But, well, what happens to Lighteners who die in the Dark World? That's probably not something that's supposed to happen.
If you die in the game, you die in real life.
If Berdly burns his wing, freeing himself from the plug, he can't move it after waking up, but it's very unclear if that's permanent. So is he truly just dead or in some comatose fallen down state? And that sounds like a silly question. It would be pointless narratively if Berdly just woke up and was fine, right? But
oh god, can you imagine? The second you leave the room in chapter 2, he just disintegrates into dust. Oh.
You fail to consider the secret, cooler third option. On top of dying in a dark world, Berdly was killed with a special spell that's only used to freeze Lightners, which isn't supposed to be possible. A spell only accessible through a game-breaking creepypasta-like route. Who's to say that kind of reality fuckery would result in an unambiguous death as opposed to him being in some weird limbo?
He could be just brain dead. His body is still fine then. Oof.
Especially when we already have another character related to Noel theorized to be trapped in the code or depths or whatever, possibly due to Dark World shenanigans. Des. Hear me out. Despite having seemingly nothing to do with Des himself, Berdly becoming who he is stems from Noel not being able to spell December. This ties his tragedy to the holiday tragedy. Noel's grocery store habits suggest some kind of previous trauma with ice. Maybe Des went missing in a blizzard, or Noel's ice abilities were involved in the same incident as her disappearance. There's another connection. And do you know how Dragon Blazers is often used by Deltarune to refer to itself? What was that Dragon Blazers reference Susie made that was oh so important to Berdly? Something about a sister being cursed? Feels like a vague reference to another sister who had, something bad happen to her. So
yeah.
There. Berdly got Des-ified in the weird route, and he's gonna do something minor. I can put theory in the video title now. Do I have a lot of evidence? No, but I think it could be interesting. The weird route is meta. It's about defying the linear narrative at all costs, and I think some cool things could happen with someone who was supposed to be a one-off side character, but whose tearing from the metaphorical bead track has created a hole in the story nevertheless. It's easy to see Berdly calling himself forgettable as partially a reference to how his death goes unacknowledged, and maybe that is the tragic angle his death is going for, but I'd like to see this statement flipped on its head a bit. It just seems fair that the game with Don't Forget as its main theme wouldn't affirm this idea. And I know the extent to which the weird route will interfere with the regular plot is debated, but Hometown's going to have to notice his not seeming awake eventually, and that's probably going to create some crisis in the Light World segments. This is getting into just wishful thinking, as if I wasn't doing that already, but if it's true that he has some familial issues, it would be cool to have his parents show up in this route only. Even if they're somewhat neglectful, that doesn't mean they wouldn't ask questions if their son disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. It would make us feel the weight and the wrongness of this supposedly forgettable character's absence by expanding on his life a bit, and somewhat extending his importance beyond where it would have ended in the normal route.
You know, this makes me think. So currently in my playthrough of Delta Traveler, and I know it's purely a mod, I made the joke about the bird you see at the bar at Grillby's. That, you know, he may be red, but, like, the way his, like, feather kind of, like, tufts at the back of his head, I joked that he could potentially be Berdly's father. So I wonder if they could, you know, if something like that could actually happen. And then in the next game, or next chapter, I should say, if, you know, you continue down past the Snowgrave route, then you see that bird again, and it's like, it's Berdly's dad, and he's like the town drunk or something like that. Ooh, oh god.
That's also debated. It's generally accepted that Noel will return to the Dark World while Berdly likely won't, but some do argue it's possible, so I want to address that. I've seen a few people suggest that his arc isn't really complete at this point. After all, he does just switch to the other extreme, proclaiming he'll fight for ignorance instead of smarts. I get where people are coming from with this, but the thing is, Berdly's decision here doesn't result in anything all that bad. While I wouldn't call the post-Ferris wheel scene a joke, we learn a lot about his character and relationship with Noel here, none of the boneheaded things he tells Noel actually have lasting consequences. This conversation only gets referenced once when Berdly says, "Let this be my real apology," sort of going back on the things he said anyway. His choice to dangerously remove himself from Queen's Wire seems to stem from his new stupid philosophy, but it's also kind of his only option besides hurting his friends, and whether or not he fries his arm in doing this is up to you. And the extremes of this philosophy are also not necessarily something he takes with him into the light world. We see that he's more amicable and grateful, and thus we can assume he'll retain the lessons he's learned, but he does have the clarity to denounce some of his more, well, stupid revelations, like suddenly being head over heels for Susie. But either way, I do think embracing dumbassery is a better idea for him than smartassery if it gets him to be nice to people. So while Berdly seems to complete his arc in the Dark World, it's true that we see very little of him in the Light World after this, and his change is comparatively subtle. This could be seen as the beginning of a background arc for him in the Light World, where we'll see how he decides to actually apply the things he's learned from his supposed dream. It's not like the Light World is irrelevant or anything. We could see him at school or church or the festival, so I wouldn't be surprised if he still continued to have a presence in mandatory scenes, potentially even outside of school. Oh yeah, also, he doesn't know that his best friend has a huge crush on someone he's only just started to respect, and that seems like it would be of interest to him. I want to see how he finds out about and reacts to that, and I think there's a chance we will. That is to say, Toby Fox, please have Berdly try to wingman for Noelle. The pun literally writes itself. Also, I want to point out these sprites from the most recent newsletter. Was anyone surprised to see Berdly here? Fan interpretations of his relationship with Chris and Susie post Chapter 2 can range from he's dating Chris to Chris and Susie barely tolerate him, but here they are, hanging out with him and enjoying birdseed.
Well, I mean, also, you gotta look at the, Noelle's face. Like, she's obviously annoyed by something here, but is it Berdly? Is it like Susie and Chris's antics? Like, something over here is bothering her.
He presumably brought. They aren't wearing swimsuits though, so maybe they just crashed his and Noelle's beach day. Obviously, this is a newsletter sprite and not a canon event, but it is official content that shows him actually getting along with them, and it's important to me, okay? All that aside, it does seem pretty noteworthy that Berdly's fried wing from you fighting him and or Queen carries over somewhat to the light world. And I think this is because Berdly as a character represents the negative impacts of Dark Worlds. Not to say he isn't positively impacted by them, but he is kind of their punching bag. In a game that wants the player to think about to what extent these worlds are real and to what extent their existence is good, he's the one getting burnt or frozen. He's the one preparing to make the new fountain before Ralsei tells everyone to stop. Bluebird of misfortune indeed. So him still being injured or possibly dead tells us that, hey, this stuff isn't all sunshine and rainbows. There can be actual lasting consequences to this.
Yeah, there's actual weight to these, like, world-shaking revelations, and, so be careful.
Hits all the harder considering he was the one planning to make the cyber world his utopia. But how impactful is his injury? A charred wing sounds pretty bad, but to what extent does that translate out of the dark world? Nothing you eat there matters, so it could be merely a temporary remnant of his injury. It's a bit unclear.
He could be just having the Dark World equivalent of sleeping on his arm wrong, and then when he wakes up, it's just nothing but pins and needles.
Berdly just says he can't move his arm, which sounds more like it's paralyzed than just broken or something, but that might be applying too much real-world logic. His line when rescuing the gang also changes from, "My energy is still too low to help you fight," to, "I can't do much for you like this," which comparatively implies some sort of permanence to his condition, but this is before he wakes up, so I really don't know. In the event that his arm is broken or even permanently impaired, that would be a pretty major thing for Berdly to adapt to. Also just extremely suspicious that this would happen to him randomly in his sleep while he was quote-unquote dreaming about injuring his arm. I don't have any super concrete ideas about what will become of this, but it seems relevant to the conversation about choices mattering, and even how much the choice to fight or spare specifically matters. Even though that doesn't seem very relevant past Chapter 1, when Berdly doesn't hurt his arm, he explicitly attributes his ability to free himself to the gang's mercy in capital letters. Pretty thematically potent, I must say. You might have noticed by now that not all of my conclusions here are particularly concrete and specific.
Well, again, as I've said multiple times before on these Deltarune theories and analyses videos, I mean, we're not even halfway through the game yet. We're so if it were 8, it'd be a quarter. We're a little over a quarter of the way through the story. So I mean, we're playing with we're not playing with a complete deck here, not in the slightest.
So, in general, what can we say about Berdly's purpose in Deltarune? Certainly he is a funny guy, an obnoxious guy, but I'd argue he's also a character. Deltarune could be said to be something of a coming-of-age story. It's set during a time of incoming change. It's the first year Chris is on their own without Asriel, and they'll be heading off to college themselves someday soon, all while hometown's past swirls around them. And within all this, we have Berdly, who is fundamentally motivated by a fear of what will become of him when he goes somewhere without Noelle. He's likely referring to college, and more broadly, to growing up. So much of his identity is wrapped up in being a student, but he won't be one forever. Along with Queen, he's an obstacle in Noelle's life who won't listen to her. Queen representing Noelle's mother, and Berdly representing Berdly. But much like Queen, he's also someone who can learn, who can be reached. Through his very punchable attitude, he compels Chris and Susie, two characters who seem to have low worth in their intelligence and what they've accomplished, to prove him wrong. And should you choose to chase after that sweet, sweet freedom sauce, he is the cost. Noelle's just as much a victim, but she's also more than that. She's determined not to be a tool again, to reclaim her agency. Berdly is simply disposed of, a victim due to his own unimportance. And I think that concept is actually cooler than we give it credit for, and I have hope the game will play around with that. You don't have to be a super serious or a main character to matter. Isn't this a game that celebrates forming bonds with silly guys? Is it so ridiculous to think that maybe he's worth not forgetting? But I'm also one of those guys who thinks rules cards should have a secret boss-esque arc, so maybe take what I say with a grain of salt.
Oh no, well, okay, so we found out what happens to Darkners when they're not in their own, dark world. But can you imagine, oh god, the rules card secret boss? Like, something happens, like, he's gone for the majority of the chapter, and then when he comes back, he's all, like, weird and messed up, like, because he had an interaction with Gaster, and now he's just as nuts as all the other secret bosses, and you have to kind of, like, smack some sense back into him. Oh no.
This is the most self-indulgent video I've ever made. Why is it 15 minutes longer than all my other essays? Actually, I know the answer. It's because I mostly wrote the script on my phone and didn't keep good track of how long it was getting until too late. Speaking of self-indulgence, I've been wanting to make a video where I just kind of yap about miscellaneous Deltarune things that are too short for individual videos, and since I reached 5,000 subscribers, thank you, by the way, I thought I could make something like that by hosting an Ask Me Anything to celebrate, so be on the lookout for that. While we're at it, I'll also take the opportunity to plug my new Deltarune animatic that I worked really hard on, link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you have a nice day.
Oh god. Well, there you have it. Why is Berdly in Deltarune? Again, just the whole thing, the whole thought that, having, again, look, I don't think I really missed any of the stuff she talked about in, Deltarune when I played it. But it's, when you put out all the pieces like that, it is absolutely fascinating how complex Berdly actually is as a character. Like, it is absolutely fascinating. Well, Stuffed Alpaca, you get a subscription from me, and I'm really wondering if I'm just like what will happen with Berdly in the future. Oh god. So yeah, that'll be it for now. So yeah, of course, as always, where's the videos linked in the description if you haven't seen it yet for some reason. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day, and yeah, with all that out of the way, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.